Welcome to part 2 of our in-depth series on working with Native Instruments form. And in this second video, we're going to take a look at the sound and effects pages. And these two areas are really going to help you to sculpt the sound that you're looking for, in addition to the motion section, but we're going to mainly focus on these two pages in this video. And first, I'm going to drag in a sample from the library that's included with form, and we're going to take about 200 or 300 seconds and just tweak some of the presets on the sound and effects pages and see what we can come up with pretty quickly by using those parameters. And then we'll come back and take a look at each of the parameters and how they relate to one another and how you can better understand how to use them to shape the sound that you'd like to create. So let's come to the sample page. Again, I'll drag that top sample from the sample folder of form, drop it on our window. We're taken to the sample select page. Let's preview that to hear what we're working with. Okay, so it's kind of like a synthesized choir. Let's load that sample. And I'm just going to shut up here and tweak away for a couple of minutes, and then we'll take a look at all of the parameters in detail. Okay, so in a pretty quick period of time, we can take a basic sound and come up with something unique and creative by tweaking these parameters here. And so now let's spend a bit of time focusing on each one of these individually and also how they relate to each other. So I'll keep the same sample loaded, but what I'm going to do is come to the bottom here and click Reset Sound. This is going to take all of the parameters back to their default position. I'll just confirm that. And you can see these have been returned. If we come to the effects page, then all of our effects have been turned off. And let's just start at the top of the sound page and make our way down and across. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have the form oscillator. And we've got pitch controls here, and we can adjust this in plus or minus 24 semitones. So plus or minus 2 octaves. Double clicking, we can take that back to the default. Below that, if we click, hold, and drag, then we can adjust in cents plus or minus 50. Just above that, we have pitch tracking, which we can see is highlighted, and we know that that's on when this has the white box surrounding that. And this is going to be on unless you activate the deform parameter here. So once we power this on, notice that the pitch tracking and flatten pitch have been deactivated. So you can only use one of these at a time, and this is going to take priority once you engage it. But we'll come back to this in a moment. For now, we'll power that off. We then have flatten pitch, and this is going to flatten the pitch curve. So if we come to the sample page, this white line is our pitch curve. That's going to be showing by default. We can hide it by clicking here, as we talked about in the part 1 video. But this particular sample doesn't have much going on with its pitch. So let's bring in a different sample really quickly. We will load that up. So now we can see this has a bit more going on. If I trigger this, we can hear that change in pitch. But if we come back to the sound and flatten that, you can hear that, as the name implies, it's going to flatten that pitch out. Next we have panning, which is self-explanatory. This could be a cool parameter to modulate subtly. We then have formant, and this shifts the formants of your sample. So turning to the right tends to give a bit more of a nasal character. Let's bring in that sample we started to work with in the beginning, because this is kind of a vocal, and I think it will be more apparent. So as we increase to the right, we get more of a nasal sound, and that diminishes as we move to the left. Next, we have formant tracking, and the formant of your sample will be adjusted to the pitch or note that you're playing when you engage this. We then have a amp parameter, and this is basically going to adjust the level of your oscillator. And note that you have this little icon here in the bracket letting you know that this amp knob is tied to envelope 1. So envelope 1 is going to control this level for the attack, decay, sustain, and release. Let's double click to take those back to the default, and the formant as well. Now below our oscillator section, we have an additive oscillator, and this can be used to help fill out your sound, and I found this to be especially helpful with adding low end frequencies for a fuller sound when I'm working with the samples. So we have an octave section here that we can click and drag up or down to make adjustments to. Double clicking, we go back to the default. Let's actually take the amp down for our oscillator, the sample that we've loaded, and only listen to the additive oscillator, so we can take the volume up. And so we can adjust the sort of waveform that's going to be played back, and by default, when we're all the way to the left, we start with a simple sine. And then moving to the center, we have a soft saw, and then all the way to the right, you'll get a soft square. And actually, something else I want to mention about the additive oscillator is that its pitch is going to follow the pitch curve of the sample that you bring in. And again, this one is flat, so I'm going to just keep switching back between these two, I guess. Let's load that. So you can see our pitch curve has changed. And when we come back to our sound, you'll note that that additive oscillator is following along with our pitch curve. And the other thing to take note of about the additive oscillator is that this oscillator is going to provide modulation to your sample that you have loaded. And under the oscillator effects, the FM is what's going to allow you to do that. So let's take the volume of our additive oscillator down and bring the amp back up of our sample. Okay, so now when we begin to introduce the modulation, and so the octave and the waveform are going to affect how this changes our sound. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind, that the settings that you have for your octave and the waveform, once you begin to introduce the modulation to your sample, those are going to have an effect on that. So in our oscillator effects section, we have controls for shaping the sample that we've loaded. And first up, we have the deform. And as we saw, once this parameter is activated, our pitch tracking and flatten pitch are going to be turned off. And so now this can be used to flatten the pitch of your audio. And as you sweep to the right or to the left, you're going to change the pitch of your audio. So again, we'll bring in that first more basic sample that has the flat pitch curve. And then when we come to the sound and the deform, let's double click to take to the default. Our pitch is flat, but we can lower by going to the left and raise our pitch when we move to the right. And if you notice that turning the deform knob will also change the timbre of your sound, and some sort of destruction and deformation of your sample is going to happen as well. But we'll double click on that to take it to the default. And next to the right, we have the shaper, and this will alter the waveform segments of your audio sample. And how this affects your sound will vary depending on the sample you've chosen. So it's best to use your ears to decide whether this parameter is getting the results that you want, and just adjust accordingly. Let's power off that deform. Let's turn the loop on for our motion. Again, so experiment with that. We've seen the FM parameter. We then have stereo, and this knob is bipolar, and turning it to the left or right will cause a jitter effect to your sample that modulates it between the left and right channels in your stereo field. So this is going to be more apparent with different samples. So let's give a listen to hear if this shows up with this sample. Let's bring in a different sample again. So you can hear that movement between the left and right. It's subtle, but it's there. We'll double click to return. We then have multiply, and multiply will compress your audio sample and introduce more harmonic content. So with that off, okay, and you can even see this in the display up above. So if we trigger our sample without the multiply on, you can see the waveform there. Then as we increase the multiply, notice how that waveform is compressed. And next we have modulation, and most of us are aware of what modulation is and have worked a lot with envelopes and LFOs. So we have 5 different modulators available for use. We've got envelope 1, which we saw is permanently attached to the amp control here. We have a second envelope and 2 LFOs and a side chain that we can make use of. For our 2 envelopes, there is an indicator here to the right, which I actually think is pretty cool. It's a very simple thing, but I always like visual feedback with some of this. So that's going to adjust itself based on the changes we make to the attack, decay, sustain, and release. So if our attack is immediate, you can see that that spikes up really quickly. Our sustain, and I'm still holding my pad, but if I release, you can see the release is very quick because our release time is set to 99 milliseconds. But if we increase our attack, say to about 2 seconds, let's also increase our release time to about 2.5 seconds. Now you'll notice this moves a lot slower to represent those changes. Our attack, the decay, sustain. Now I'll release the pad on my controller and notice that slow release time that we added of 2.5 seconds. Okay, I'll take these back down, and moving on to the LFO, we have a similar indicator here, and this is going to reflect the speed that we've selected. So we can adjust the speed of our LFO here, taking that up. We can see that that's reflecting the changes that we've made. There are 4 different waveforms that we can choose for our LFOs. So we've got the sine, we've got a triangle, square, and random. We can also choose between Hertz or BPM. So in Hertz, you can see that below there, 5.72 Hertz, all the way up to 30. If we switch to BPM, then this is going to be in relation to the tempo in our DAW. We've got quarter notes, half notes, and so on. Let's change back to our sine, and we then have trig and free. So when trigger is on, the cycle of this LFO is going to be re-triggered every time you press a note or a key. Let's actually assign this back to our frequency modulation. So I'll select LFO 1, and this is how you can assign modulation, by the way. So just by clicking, you'll see that these highlight when you hover on the names below. Click once, then you have this menu where you can click to select the modulation source. I'm choosing LFO 1. Then we need to set the amount. This is bipolar. So as I increase that, you'll notice we have some activity down below. Click on the name to close that out. Let's activate this so we can actually hear it. Changing the waveform. But I wanted to show the trig. So you see when I trigger, the indicator there jumps back to the beginning each time we do that. When we're in free mode, it's just going to continue on in the cycle without interruption. We then have a phase, and this will allow you to adjust the phase in the LFO signal in relation to the time axis. And as I mentioned, we have a second LFO and also sidechain, and we'll cover more of the modulation section in later tutorials on sound design with form. I also want to mention the macros down at the bottom, because these you can assign multiple parameters to and create drastic changes with one movement of these macros down below. And we'll come back to that when we are in the effects section. And finally, on the sound page, we have the filter. Most of us are familiar with filters, so we won't spend too much time here. Just know that you have the option between a low pass, high pass, and a notch filter. You then have your cutoff and resonance available as well. Let's move on to the effects page, and everything's going to be off by default. At the very top here, we have frequency shaping, so we can activate that. And we have these bands that we can make use of. So in the display, we can click, hold, and drag at the top to lower or raise the level of the particular band. This works in tandem with the dial here to the left. Band 2. We have center control, which is going to control the horizontal position, and width control. If we'd like to control the width in the display, we just click, hold, and drag up and down. Okay, and these could also be modulated as well. So coming down again to the labels beneath for the center, for instance, we could come here, assign that to the LFO as well. Let's take this up a little bit. Let's put a little bit more in there. Okay, so you can see how that's done. We have dry wet control for our band filter. And let's actually remove that modulation. Anytime we'd like to remove, just click again on the name, come to the display there, and choose no source. I'll double click here, and we're all set. We've got phase control, and once we've activated frequency shaping, we can then access the warmth section. You can only access this if you power on the frequency shaping, and then here we can add drive and charge to our sample. So by default, this is going to be set to all, so all of the frequencies are going to be affected here, but we can choose to have the bands only affected. And then to the right, we can choose between digital and tube. Let's go ahead and power this off and move on. We then have dynamics. This is basically going to add compression to your signal, and most of us are familiar with compression. We've got attack, release, the ratio, and output gain. We also have a meter up above to show how much compression is being applied to our signal. We then have delay, and when we activate this, the ping pong effect, moving that delay between the left and right channels, is going to be on. We've got feedback, but if we'd like to take that ping pong down, we can just click, hold, and drag and pull that down. And it's going to be more centered. We've got damping that we can apply. And then finally, we have reverb. We've got level, size, low damp, and high damp. And there's also several different spaces that we can choose from. We start on small. We can move to large, space, cheap, and unreal. So if we'd like to remove low frequencies from the reverb itself, the reverb tail, we can use the low damp. So now we're only left with the high frequencies. To attenuate the high frequencies, we could take the high damp up. So So now it's more of a thicker, warm reverb tail. Okay, and so that is the effects page, and we talked about the macros earlier, and I said I was going to discuss these on the effects page. So let's turn our delay and reverb back on just so we can see that. So for the level, for the delay and reverb, we have those here. If we click on the label, we can then click and assign a macro, so M1, and let's take this up a little bit here, close that out, come to the level for our reverb. Again, we will choose the macro. We want M1, and we'll take this up a little bit as well. So now we've got this M1 control assigned to both the delay and reverb. So as I make an adjustment here, it's going to increase the level for both of these. You can see the activity on the levels there. So a cool way to make drastic changes to parameters when you are working with form, if we were to click on the name at the very bottom of our macro, then we can actually choose these labels that are set. So we could maybe effects would be the best thing to apply to this one, and we know that this is going to increase the level of our effects. And then finally, in the bottom right hand corner, we have a global modulation amount. So adjusting this by click, hold, and dragging left or right is going to increase or decrease the modulation for all of the parameters that we've assigned modulation to. So let's come back to the sound page. We see we have modulation on the FM. If I click, hold, and drag this to the left, that's been taken off of our FM. So if there are other modulation assignments that have been made to the parameters here, then we can adjust all of them in one go with this modulation amount if we would like to. Okay, and so I think we will wrap up here, and in part 3, and I think what will be the final in this series, we will take a closer look at the curve presets and also the curve editor. And the bulk of our time will spend in the curve editor because these curves are going to have a huge effect on the shape of our sound and the sound that's output. So I think it's really important to understand the curve presets and experiment with those, and also going about creating our own and manipulating the curves that we create within the editor here. Okay, so I hope to see you in the third part of this series, and thanks for watching.